Everyone ignored his farm, not because they didn't see it, but because, over time, they had learned not to. There was nothing there worth looking at anymore. The soil had lost its color. The ground had hardened into something closer to stone than earth, and whatever had once grown there had stopped trying a long time ago. If you drove past it, you wouldn't slow down. Most people didn't. They had already made up their minds about that land years ago. Nothing grows there. Nothing ever will. And anyone who thinks otherwise is wasting their time. But then something changed. Not the land. Not at first. The person who owned it. Because one day, someone new showed up. His name was Caleb Turner, and unlike everyone else, he didn't see a dead farm. He saw a question no one had answered yet. Caleb wasn't from a long line of successful farmers. He didn't inherit acres of thriving land or expensive equipment. There was no family legacy waiting for him. No safety net. No backup plan. Just a decision. A risky one. The kind most people avoid their entire lives. Because Caleb didn't buy that farm because it made sense. He bought it because it was the only opportunity he could afford. By the time he found it, the land had already been passed over by multiple buyers. People came, looked at it, and left. Some didn't even get out of their trucks. The previous owner had a reputation in town. Not for success, but for trying everything and failing anyway. He had invested in irrigation systems, spent money on soil treatments, tested different crops season after season. And every time, the result was the same. Weak growth, poor harvests, financial losses. Eventually, he stopped talking about solutions and started talking about selling. Not because he wanted to move on, but because he had no other choice. When Caleb made the offer, it surprised people. Not because it was high, but because there was an offer at all. Most people thought he didn't know what he was getting into. Others thought he was desperate. And the truth was, he was a little bit of both. The first morning Caleb stepped onto that land as its owner. There was no excitement, no sense of victory, just silence. The kind that makes you realize exactly how much work is ahead of you. He stood there for a while, looking across the empty field, trying to imagine what it could become. But imagination doesn't change reality. And reality, at that moment, was a farm that had already defeated someone before him. Still, he got to work. Because that's what farmers do. They don't wait for perfect conditions. They start anyway. The early days followed a simple routine. Wake up before sunrise, step outside into the cold morning air, and begin again. Caleb started with what he knew. He worked the soil, cleared debris, prepared the land the same way any farmer would. Then he planted. Carefully, methodically, as if effort alone could bring the ground back to life. And for a while, it felt like it might. Small sprouts appeared, tiny signs that something was happening beneath the surface. Just enough to keep hope alive, but not enough to change anything. Because hope, on a farm like this, doesn't last long without results. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And slowly, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The sprouts didn't grow, the soil didn't improve, and no matter how much time he put in, the outcome stayed the same. Nothing changed. At first, Caleb told himself it just needed more time. Maybe the soil was adjusting. Maybe the weather wasn't right. Maybe the next batch would be different. But deep down, he could feel it, that quiet realization creeping in. This wasn't working. Around town, people had already noticed, not because Caleb said anything, but because farms don't fail quietly. Someone always sees. Someone always talks. You heard about that new guy? The one who bought that dead land? Yeah, won't be long now. At the local supply store, conversations shifted when he walked in. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. Fewer questions. Less interest, a different tone, because people had seen this before, and they believed they knew how it would end. At first, Caleb tried not to let it get to him. He stayed focused, kept working, kept planting, kept hoping. But there's something about being surrounded by doubt that slowly changes the way you think, not all at once. Just little by little, until one day, you start questioning things you were once certain about. And for Caleb, that day came quietly. It was late in the evening. The sun was setting behind the field, casting long shadows across the same ground he had been working for months. He sat down near the edge of the land, tired, not just physically, but mentally. Because effort without progress has a way of draining something deeper. He looked out across the field, and for the first time since he bought it, he didn't see potential. He saw exactly what everyone else had been seeing all along. A farm that wasn't producing, a plan that wasn't working, and a future that was starting to feel uncertain. That was the moment everything could have ended. No one would have blamed him for walking away. In fact, most people expected it, because from the outside, there was no reason to stay. No visible progress. No sign that things were about to change. Just a pattern of failure repeating itself. Over and over again. But as Caleb sat there, something caught his attention. Not across the whole field, not in the areas he had been working the hardest, but off to the side. In a part of the land he hadn't focused on much. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But it was different. The ground looked slightly darker. The texture wasn't as hard. And there, pushing up through the surface, was something small, but alive. Most people would have ignored it. After everything that wasn't working, one small patch wouldn't mean much. But Caleb didn't look away. Because in a field where nothing grows, even the smallest sign of life matters. He stood up slowly, walked over to it, and crouched down for a closer look. The soil felt different. Softer, cooler, as if something beneath the surface had changed. He didn't fully understand it yet, but he knew one thing for sure. This part of the land wasn't behaving like the rest. And in that moment, without fully realizing it, Caleb stopped trying to force the farm to work his way, and started asking a different question. What if the problem was never the land? Caleb didn't leave that spot right away. He stayed there for a while, crouched over that small patch of land that looked different from everything else around it. At first, it didn't make sense. How could one part of the farm behave so differently when the rest of it refused to grow anything at all? Same land, same weather, same effort, and yet a completely different result. He reached down and picked up a handful of soil. Let it fall slowly through his fingers. It didn't feel like the rest. It wasn't as dry. It wasn't as lifeless. There was something holding it together, something beneath the surface that he hadn't been paying attention to before. And that's when a thought crossed his mind. Not loud, not fully formed, but enough to stop him from walking away. What if this farm wasn't failing? What if it had just been misunderstood the entire time? The next morning, Caleb didn't start his routine the way he usually did. He didn't go straight to the rows he had been planting for months. He didn't reach for the same tools. Instead, he went back to that spot. And this time, he paid closer attention. He watched how the sunlight hit that part of the land, how long it stayed there. He looked at the shape of the ground, the slight dip where water could settle after rain. And slowly, pieces started coming together. This wasn't just random growth. This was a pattern, a small one, but a real one. And if there was a pattern, then there was something to learn. For the next few days, Caleb stopped trying to fix the entire farm and focused on understanding that one section. He came back to it at different times of the day, morning, afternoon, even just before sunset. He noticed how the soil stayed cooler there, how moisture didn't disappear as quickly, how certain plants didn't struggle as much. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to ask a bigger question. What if the problem wasn't the soil itself, but how the land had been used? Because everything he had done so far, Everything the previous owner had done followed the same approach. Treat the entire farm the same, plant the same way, water the same way, expect the same results across every acre. But what if that was the mistake? For the first time since buying the farm, Caleb stopped trying to control it and started trying to understand it. That decision didn't come with confidence. It came with uncertainty. Because once you step away from what's familiar, you don't have a clear path anymore. Just possibilities and risks. A few days later, he made his first real change. Not a big one, not something anyone else would notice. But for him, it meant everything. He stopped planting in straight, uniform rows. Instead, he broke the pattern, adjusted spacing, shifted positions, focused more on areas where the land seemed to respond better, and less on the parts that resisted everything. Then he did something even more unexpected. He stopped clearing certain sections, letting parts of the land grow naturally, wild, uncontrolled. At least, that's how it looked from the outside. If anyone had driven past the farm at that point, they would have been even more convinced that Caleb had lost direction. Because now, instead of a struggling farm, it looked like a neglected one. The clean rows were gone. The structure was gone. The sense of order people expect from a farm, gone. And the comments returned, stronger this time. I knew it wouldn't work. He's not even trying anymore. That place is done for good. But Caleb didn't respond. Not because he didn't hear them, but because he was too focused on something else. Something they couldn't see yet. Because while the farm looked worse from the outside, there were small changes happening within it. The soil in certain areas began to hold moisture longer. Not everywhere. Just in specific spots. The kind most people would overlook. Tiny plants began growing where he hadn't planted anything. Not large, not impressive, but consistent. And for the first time, the farm didn't feel completely unresponsive. Still, there were no guarantees, no clear signs that this would work on a larger scale. Just small improvements that could either lead to something bigger or disappear completely. That's what made this stage the hardest, because it didn't feel like success. It felt like uncertainty. Every decision Caleb made from that point forward carried risk. If he was wrong, he wasn't just losing time anymore. He was losing his last real chance. But if he was right, then everything about that farm could change. So he leaned into it. He started reshaping parts of the land, not with heavy machinery, not with expensive systems, but with intention. He created slight slopes in certain areas, redirected how water moved after rainfall, allowed it to settle where it naturally wanted to stay, instead of forcing it away. He began testing different types of plants, not the ones most farmers relied on, but ones that adapted better to uneven conditions, ones that didn't require perfect soil to survive. Some worked, some didn't. But every result gave him something he didn't have before: information. And slowly, the farm began to shift. Not in a way that was obvious to everyone, but in a way that mattered. Because underneath the surface, things were changing. The soil wasn't fighting him as much. The land wasn't resisting every attempt. There was movement, small but real. And for the first time since he bought the farm, Caleb wasn't just hoping anymore. He was starting to believe. But belief alone wasn't enough, because what came next would determine everything. For a while, nothing dramatic happened. No sudden transformation. No overnight success. Just small changes, building on top of each other. The kind most people would miss, because they weren't looking closely enough. The soil continued to improve. Not everywhere, but in the areas Caleb had focused on. The places where water settled, where the land was allowed to behave naturally, instead of being forced into something it wasn't. The plants in those areas began growing stronger, healthier, more resilient. And then something unexpected happened. The growth didn't stay contained. It started spreading. slowly at first, then more noticeably. The areas that once struggled the most began responding, not perfectly, but differently. And for the first time, the farm no longer felt like something broken. It felt like something waking up. Caleb noticed it immediately, because he had been watching every detail, every change, every reaction. And now, the land was finally responding back. That's when he made his next move. He didn't rush to scale everything at once. He didn't try to take over every acre again. Instead, he doubled down on what was already working. He expanded the zones that held moisture, refined the flow of water across the land, introduced more crops that thrived under those exact conditions. Not the most common crops, not the easiest ones, but the right ones. The kind that didn't just survive, but produced something valuable, something different. And that difference changed everything, because what Caleb started growing wasn't just another harvest. It was high-demand, premium produce, the kind local markets didn't see often. The kind buyers were willing to pay more for. At first, he brought in small batches, just enough to test it, and something surprising happened. It sold out immediately. Not slowly, not eventually, immediately. Buyers came back asking for more. Markets started requesting consistent supply. Word began to spread, quietly at first, then faster. Because in a place where everyone had written that farm off, something unusual was happening, and people were starting to notice. The next week, Caleb increased production. Still careful, still controlled, but bigger. And again, everything sold, this time even faster. That's when the numbers started changing, not gradually, dramatically. What started as a small recovery turned into something much bigger. Orders increased, demand grew, opportunities opened up that hadn't existed before. And then, it happened. The moment no one saw coming. That same farm, the one people ignored, the one they called dead, the one they laughed at, started generating over $500,000 a week. Not in theory, not in potential, in reality. Every single week. It didn't make sense to most people, because they never saw what Caleb saw. They only saw the surface. The dry soil, the failed crops, the early struggle. They didn't see the observation, the patience, the willingness to do things differently. And by the time they realized something had changed, it was already too late to understand how. Cars started slowing down as they passed the farm. People who once ignored it now stopped to look. Some came with questions. Others came with curiosity. A few came with something else entirely. Regret. Because they remembered exactly what they had said. That land is finished. He won't last. It's a waste. Now, they were standing in front of something completely different. A farm that didn't just survive, but thrived in a way no one expected. And Caleb? He didn't celebrate the way people imagined he would. There were no big announcements, no dramatic reactions, just the same routine. Waking up early, walking the land, paying attention. Because for him, this was never about proving people wrong. It was about understanding something they didn't take the time to see. And that understanding changed everything. But the most powerful part of his story wasn't the money, not even the success. It was the moment he almost walked away. Because if he had left that day, if he had listened to the noise, if he had believed what everyone else believed, none of this would have happened. That farm would still be sitting there, dry, ignored, forgotten, just like before. And that's what makes the difference. Not luck, not timing, but the decision to stay when leaving feels easier, the decision to look closer when everyone else looks away, because sometimes what looks like failure is just something waiting to be understood. And the people who find success aren't always the ones with the best resources. They're the ones who pay attention, who adapt, who keep going, long after others have already made up their minds. So the next time something looks like it's not working, look again. Because the opportunity might already be there, waiting for someone willing to see it differently.